Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Geordie Tocher's daughter, Cathy, and this is my cousin, Bob Aylesworth. Bob and I spent many hours working with my dad over the years on all sorts of different projects, but tonight we're going to talk about the time my dad built a dugout canoe and sailed it to Hawaii. Dad believed, as did Thor Heyerdahl, that some of the original inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands traveled from the west coast to British Columbia following the currents and trade winds. Their legend spoke of several ancestors coming from the land of sun, where the trees are without leaves for half the year and you can walk on water, referring to ice. They also found over 200 common words and many similar building techniques. By the mid-1960s, Dad was determined to prove his theory. Like Heyerdahl, his ambition was greater than simply being the first to complete a historical crossing. He hoped to launch the field of anthropology into a new arena. He went on the search for a perfect log and found it high in the mountains above Squamish.
In 1969, I went high up into the mountains above Squamish, and at the 2,500-foot level found a grove of cedar trees, and I hoped out of that I would find a good solid one. Finally, spotted one, kept my fingers crossed that it was solid, and prayed to it that it wouldn't break or split when it fell, and promised it a good and useful future, same way the old instructions tell you to do it. I started to follow it. The ancient people might have taken a week with stone chisels and hammers to fell a tree of this size, but here I was doing it in a rather pioneer fashion with pioneer chainsaws, and it was going to take me about 10 minutes. It was the same feeling the ancient people must have had, sort of moment of truth, the realization that now the search is ended and the work of building a dugout starts. When I got the chainsaw into the tree, I discovered it was a little punky, but kept my fingers crossed it would be solid. Well, after cutting 40 feet of wood from the stump up to the farther up the tree, I found it reasonably solid, and with a diameter in a little less than 5 feet, I started knocking some weight off. I cut a section 50 feet long, which was to be the length of the canoe, and I calculated that that log must have weighed about 10 tons. At that level on the mountain, the winters sometimes leave about 25 feet of snow, so I cut holes in the log so that if it filled with water it wouldn't turn to ice, and split the canoe. I took some weight off, but I didn't want to take too much, or it would weaken the log and it might split on the trip down to the water. The ocean was 8 miles away, and I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to travel. But anyway, I kept working. With the fall approaching, I always kept a fire going for Friendly next to me. And after a month or so living next to it up in the mountains, I was getting it closer and closer to the time I'd take it down to the salt water. It was 200 feet from a logging road, and I used scrap wood to fill in cavities and holes, and cleared brush, hoped I'd cleared a fairly good trail, and trimmed the log and made it as smooth as I could. And then, on the day that we were to take it to the water, we discovered the first snowfall of the year the night before, clawed our way up the mountain, four-wheel drives, and it took about 3 hours because underneath that snow there was glaciation, sheets of ice that were occasionally 500 to 1,000 feet long, where underground springs had been flowing across the gravel and freezing. The snow was an unexpected friend or foe, I wasn't sure. The log would slide more easily on snow, but I was afraid too that it might go too quickly, and it was a very steep logging road I had to go down on. The ancient canoe carvers, of course, would have had their cedar trees down close to the water anyway, and rough them out a little more and then get the whole village to come down and assist. But we had a four-wheel drive that weighed about 2 tons, and that was supposed to pull an 8-ton log down the mountain, so there was a lot of apprehension. One of the fears was that the log would slide away too quickly, so I put a chain around it, not only to slow it down from sliding, but I was afraid if it had some bad bumps it might suddenly split. I was also afraid on the steep slope down to the main road that it might go too fast, so I put a rope around it and wrapped the rope around the stump. That was a move that wasn't too necessary as it turned out, but after a false start in which the log didn't move, we repositioned the truck, put on full power, and gave it everything we had, and by golly, it started to move. Had 200 feet to go down to the main road. It hung up on a bump before we got there, and then it jumped 20 feet, and before it went across the road and down 200 feet down the canyon, taking the truck with it, it stopped. Now we had 8 miles to go across the snow and down the mountains. Had an awful time getting it started and realized that if it ever stopped on an absolute flat area, it'd be very difficult to get it going again. One of my fears was the ice that was underneath the road in some of the steep places. My cameraman dashed ahead at one point to get some look at it going past. It rolled, pushed him down into the snow in between 2 stumps, and before it went down in the canyon, it just stopped and kept going. Further down the mountain, when we were following it with a four-wheel drive, we watched the log start to speed up, and a frightened face of the driver looking out the back window, so he speeded the truck up, knowing that if the log hit the truck it might be game over for him and they'd both go over the cliffs.
The tools that Geordie used, of course, his chainsaw, but all the hand tools, these are the long-handled tools. He had other short-handled tools, scorps, etc., but adzes and axes and broad axes, and there was a lot of hand work involved.
So here's my dad at age 44. Mom was 41. I'm 13, standing there by the sail, and that's my sister Tana at age 12. We just took it out for a bit of a float.
Geordie talked long friend Dave Moon, who probably a lot of you remember from the book Stall and stuff. He was quite the character, and he joined him on the first voyage. He was British Navy, and that was the summer of '71.
After the second gale we had a day of clear, and then with our radio broken down but a little transistor still operating which told us that there was a southwest gale due, we thought, gee, we're going to get hammered into the coast, so we'll head for San Francisco. We'll get the vessel stove fixed and the radio fixed and then head out again. But in the heavy fog off San Francisco we hit a reef and didn't make it. The vessel split from one end to another. The mast trapped Dave in the wreckage, and after getting him out we were swept over the top of the reef and into the cliffs. quite a shock because we were looking forward to some hot meals and a warm bath. We had been shivering for 3 solid weeks at sea. We're 30 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge and expected that after the stove and radio was fixed that it would be home free and into the trade winds all the way to San Francisco, to Hawaii. Even our containers were dragged back out through the waves with the current, and the Coast Guard fellow that came down said that, "Gee, you're sure lucky." I said, "What do you mean? There's 2.5 years of my life being turned into splinters." He said, "Yes, but you're still alive, aren't you?" And he told us about 3 of the Coast Guard men who died right at that point just a week before. They were on a 38-foot self-righting lifeboat, which did hit the beach, but they weren't ever found. After a week's time, a truck was sent down from Canada to take us and some of the gear that we'd saved back. So on our way home, we went down to the beach to have a last look at what might have happened. We discovered the wreckage was still there that the lashings had held, and I wondered to myself, could I possibly ever do that again?
Geordie didn't give up very easily on things, and in '77, the District of West Vancouver offered him a 18-ton Douglas fir log, which had fallen in one of the parks, and apparently perhaps North Piccadilly, and it was 600 years old. So the log was moved to a lot at Panorama. Those of you who knew Geordie and knew the time might have visited him up there, but he got to carving the second canoe, and it was 3 tons, 40 feet long, 6-foot beam, and 16 inches wider than the first canoe, and almost twice as heavy.
I would often go up and help Dad out. Here I am working on one of the cuddy frames. Then came the day of the big move. This was really exciting. Down to Fisherman's Cove. Dad had previously built a 15-foot dugout canoe, which would become the secondary hull. This is my cousin Lindy and I giving Dad goodbye kisses. We'd been busy filling up the boat with all the supplies loaded into plastic olive containers. Here's where everyone held their breath while it was lowered into the water. Fisherman's Cove. And it floated. Everyone was happy about that. I think as soon as Gerhard saw it float, he was on board for the adventure.
So, on May 14th, 78, Geordie with navigator Gerhard Kiesel and anthropology instructor Karen Lynn took off on the first 21 days of the adventure that encountered rough seas all the way to California, where Karen disembarked to return to her studies. The crew was then joined by Richard Tomkies, journalist and longtime friend of Geordie's. They left Santa Cruz on June 29th. Geordie was constantly tightening and lashing and had to replace the rudder several times. But he was really good with his knots.
Richard caught a beautiful mahi-mahi trolling a lure behind the boat.
We had very little water aboard and realized the storm must be rougher than we figured it was. In the voyage, we got 3 days of sunshine, but quite often...
I just wanted to pause it here and say, is there a sextant in the crowd? Jack Kennedy lent my dad his sextant to take on the voyage, and Cathy, his daughter, was nice enough to bring it with her today.
Quite often, at noon, the hot sun would burn a glow through the clouds, enough so that Gerhard could get a noon shot. Our crazy little $25 time cube radio always seemed to work. Then one day, as 2 of us were sitting with the trade wind behind us, we looked We knew that we were about 150 miles from the Hawaiian Islands, and we looked at a cloud that looked to be about 45 degrees up in the air, and after a couple of hours we realized that that dark line above the cloud was land and Mount Wanaloa. So our spirits got up. We retrimmed the vessel and started to worry a little bit, because now steering wasn't directly in front of the wind, but we'd have to maneuver around the islands. So if you can imagine how we felt, we had gone through 5 gales, fought for our lives, no time to do anything else, and realized after 10 years from the inception of the voyage that here looked like a 95% chance that we're going to make it.
So despite the pounding the Orenda was taking, its navigator Kiesel and them had them on a direct and almost perfect course to their destination. Thank you, Gerhard, for that. They surprised their welcoming committee by getting there early and had to redo their arrival. And then Dad sailed it up to the Sunshine Coast, where his friends Andy and Luke have cared for it ever since. Brian Lee wrote a great article celebrating the 40th anniversary of the voyage. It spans 2 issues, in the December 2018 issue and the January 2019 issue of the Harbour Spiel. Here's my sister Tana polishing the plaque at Dunderav Pier. A nice sketch by Ken Davidson, a longtime family friend. Another one by P. Ballard Anderson. I don't know if it has any relation to you guys. And a Norris cartoon. Everyone recognizes Norris, I'm sure.
Can everybody read that? Can you read that out, Cathy?
Yes, it just says, "When's the last time you took me canoeing anywhere, much less to Hawaii?" And then we've just got a bunch of poems that some friends wrote for Dad. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.